All right. So we are going to talk about wildlife habitat on working farms, and we'll start with a little agenda here of some of the items that we're going to go over today. We'll start with some habitat enhancement on larger farms and kind of go over a little bit of background information about wildlife habitat in general. Then we'll move on to some game bird habitat, which, full disclosure, was supposed to actually be a presentation by a colleague of mine, but she's not able to be here today. So I've got her presentation and I'm going to do my best there. Then we'll have a brief little break of about 5 minutes or so before moving into some habitat enhancement for smaller farms, specifically looking at a case study of a local bee farm, Dover Bee Farm, that has really incorporated wildlife habitat in a really neat way into just his yard, actually. After that, I'll hand things off to a colleague of mine to talk about some invasive species management, and then we'll go over an overview of my program before we close with any final questions and things, discussion. So, farms and wildlife. What counts as wildlife? When people say the word wildlife, we tend to think of a lot of charismatic megafauna, maybe some deer, some bears, bobcats, larger animals. Maybe if you're a birder, you think of songbirds or woodpeckers, raptors, things like that. Or as a farmer, you might think of some more nuisance wildlife that, like the raccoons that might get into your corn or the sandhill cranes that might eat your seed. But we have all sorts of diverse wildlife throughout this country, which is huge. But even just in Michigan, there's a great diversity of both wildlife and ecosystems. And that includes things like insects and arachnids and other smaller critters that we might not think of because they're not as in our face as some of the larger animals, but they are still kind of very much important to our ecosystems. There are also very diverse types of farms, even just within Genesee County. We've got some urban farms that are as little as 1/10 of an acre, all the way up to a couple of farms that are traditional row crop operations that farm over 10,000 acres. And throughout the state of Michigan, we've got a huge diversity of farming types as well. There's the row crops who might do things like a corn, soy, wheat rotation. We've got orchards, we've got berry farms, we've got vegetables over on the West Coast, dry beans in the thumb. We have horse farms and dairy farms, even things like emu farms and all kinds of stuff, really. It's really quite remarkable how diverse our state is. Even the cut flower farms are starting to make more of a comeback as well. And if we look at the US overall, about 60% of the US is privately owned land. And out of the lower 48, about 71% of the states are in rural land use. So there's a lot of farming activity going on, and there's not a lot of like government owned wilderness for wildlife to call home. But this doesn't have to be an either or scenario. It doesn't have to be human land use or wildlife land use. Things can kind of mesh together and coincide. And in fact, there are even instances where wildlife can help to enhance agriculture, like when you've got certain beneficial wasps. Like this is an example at the bottom of a cute little cuckoo wasp, which doesn't really predate on a lot of insects, but he's pretty. But we need to realize that there's no one size fits all conservation plan for all farms. Again, we have such a diversity of farms and of wildlife that you can't necessarily guarantee that something that's going to work, say in the UP, is going to work down on an urban farm, in the Detroit area. You need to look at each inch of your land individually because every inch is different. You need to assess what's going to work in your particular situation, what you have the capability to install, look at what's already there. If maybe there's something that you could enhance for wildlife, or maybe you're lucky enough to have a blank slate and a cool idea and you can start from scratch because you have that opportunity. Say if you have some land that's no longer being put into row crops, then maybe you would turn it into grassland habitat. Basically, if you build a habitat, they will come. You will end up with wildlife utilizing what you've given them. So we're going to start out talking about large farms. Now, large is kind of relative, especially when you're talking about farms. Basically, what we mean by this is that you are a farm with more acres to work with. Maybe instead of 1/10 of an acre, you have 100 acres, which 100 acres might not be a lot to someone in the thumb who farms a few thousand acres, but we work with what we've got, and you've got little pockets and areas throughout your property that you manage that could be utilized for wildlife purposes. There are actually a lot of government and non-government cost share funding opportunities to install conservation practices on your farm. Organizations like the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service and Farm Service Agency provide a lot of cost share under the Farm Bill, with the reasoning there being that if we put conservation into practice on private land and on farms, those ecological benefits are going to stretch beyond the farms and benefit all of America. So maybe we're doing something to try to prevent phosphorus runoff from leaving that farm and getting into our waterways, which benefits everyone by having cleaner waterways and fewer potential toxic algae blooms. There's also some funding opportunities through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, through the Nature Conservancy, particularly in the Saginaw Bay watershed, which happens to be right where we're located, through MSU's Kellogg Biological Station MyStrips program, which is a new program that was actually more of a pilot program done in Iowa, where they've actually taken strips of native prairie type land and interspersed it within different crop fields to see what benefits they could get from that. And it's been so successful that now they're starting such a program in Michigan. And it's worth noting that a lot of the cost share funding from these programs is just that, it's cost share. It's not exactly a grant. And a lot of times it's not going to cover the entirety of the process. The farm's going to be responsible for some of that cost, but not all of it. So it makes it a little more accessible and kind of defrays some of the cost of installing conservation practices. So some of these practices on larger farms might include things like conservation cover. Well, we define conservation cover as permanent vegetative cover that might include things like pollinator habitat, brood cover, nesting cover, wildlife food, etc. So down at the bottom here, you can see that this was definitely brood cover for, I believe that was a bobwhite quail. They are a game bird that likes to nest in grassland areas. And it's important for them to have these grasses because that's where a lot of their chicks can feed on the various insects that occupy these biomes. Over on the right here, there was actually a restored oak savanna that a conservation district in Ohio was able to install in an area that was pretty much surrounded by soybeans. In fact, there were soybeans all the way to the horizon as far as the eye can see, not broken up by woodlots and things like we tend to have here in Michigan. These were enormous soybean fields. So this one area of kind of prairie habitat was pretty much serving as an oasis for most of the wildlife in the area. We saw all kinds of hummingbirds in there. There were lots of bees and butterflies, and pretty much every flower seemed to be covered in little occupants. Things like this partridge pea in the front and the echinacea and purple coneflowers in the back. They had all kinds of little guys who were really enjoying the food because obviously monocultures like traditional agricultural row crops don't supply a lot of variety, so there's not a lot of opportunities for these insects to feed. Larger farms that have more acres to work with also might consider installing strips of pollinator habitat within cropland. So like the MyStrips program that I just mentioned, you might take these prairie strips and actually take land out of production, which can be kind of iffy if you've got a farm where you're really trying to maximize your return. But if I've encountered farms who've done it who find that the benefits outweigh the costs they think, or it helps them feel like they're giving back to the environment, so they're happy to do it. Yes, Sam.
I'm just wondering about the use of pesticides in tandem with something like a pollinator garden as like an island or as a strip on the edge. Is there any study on how it might affect pollinators to be like utilizing those forages, I guess?
So as far as pesticides carry over from the field onto the strips? Is that
Yeah,
what
it
you're
just seems
asking?
dangerously close.
It does seem dangerously close, yeah. Well, okay, so there's a couple of different ways to think about that. A lot of the farms who are willing to install prairie strips are farms who kind of try to minimize the use of pesticides anyway. So they might maintain a buffer between their prairie strip or their field border and their where they would apply pesticides, or they would try not to apply pesticides. As far as actual study of carryover, that's a question that I heard asked recently at an MSU meeting, and there wasn't really a straight answer. They kind of started talking more about genetically modified corn and how the pollen carrying over wasn't thought to be a big deal. So I guess a lot more studies need to be done is probably the key there. Certainly we don't want to lure insects into these pollinator strips only to kill them with carried over pesticides, but that would be something that the farm would probably have to keep in mind as part of their overall management. Maybe they'd want more of a setback so that they don't damage the pollinator populations that they're trying to boost. So excellent question. As I mentioned, field borders might be another thing that they might consider doing in addition to these pollinator strips in the middle of the field. I'm sorry, distracted here. So a lot of times on field edges, you might see less production than what you get in the middle of the field. So whether fertilizers just aren't applied as uniformly, or maybe there's just too much traffic from driving trucks and tractors and trailers and things back and forth on those edges, it tends to be compacted. It's not very fertile soil. And if a farm was to actually analyze their yield monitor data, or just pay attention to the yields that they're getting off that portion of the field, a lot of times they'd actually find that they're losing money. That it would actually be cheaper to just leave that land fallow than it is to plant it. But leaving land fallow gives the opportunity for weeds and things to move in, and also really doesn't do any good for anybody. And it might provide opportunities for erosion as well if there's no vegetative cover there. So it might behoove them to actually plant these field edges to more of a pollinator habitat or conservation cover, and then they can get these beneficial insects moving in. And just basically these roots holding the soil in place, so they're not going to have that erosion problem. And they can also serve as a bit of a filter strip as well, so that if there happens to be a ditch or surface water on the other side, that anything running off that field, any kind of fertilizers and things, will be sucked up by those plants before they get into waters of the state. So it can decrease pollution as well. I have heard anecdotal evidence from a farmer saying that he feels like since he planted pollinator strips and field edges around his field, he saw a ton of praying mantises, and he felt like it drastically reduced his pest populations. There was no scientific study done on that particular instance, but he felt like it was definitely worth it, and he thought he was getting a good return on the management that he was putting into his land, agriculturally, as well as just enjoying the fact that he felt like he was doing something good for the land. So larger farms with more acres might also include some woodlots. These won't be the same as the kinds of large swaths of forest land like what we get up north, but you might have maybe 3-5 acres, maybe 20 to 40 acres sometimes of these woodland areas just in the middle of a farm field, something that really can't be farmed. A lot of times it's too wet or it was just never cleared. But if you actually take the time to manage those woodlots in a way that keeps natural resources in mind, there are things that we can do to improve both the habitat and the human value from those woodlots. So there are opportunities to use them for recreation. You can use them for wildlife viewing, for hunting, sustainable timbering, aesthetics, etc. I mean, people love trees. We all love having forest land around, but if you have a woodlot, it doesn't tend to function quite the same necessarily as if you have hundreds and hundreds of acres of contiguous forest. There's a lot more opportunities for invasive species to move in. There are just the trees are managed differently. Sometimes they're younger, sometimes the age classes of trees aren't quite what would be most beneficial to the wildlife. If you decide to, say, cut out the mature oaks that are left to try to get some timber value, it might not be done in the most environmentally friendly way. So we'd recommend getting an actual professionally written plan to do some forest stand improvement. And if you have 10 acres or more, even if you have less, but particularly with 10 acres or more, a lot of farms will apply for cost share assistance through the Natural Resource Conservation Service to actually hire a forester to come out, walk your property with you, listen to your goals for the property, and write you this plan, and the NRCS will pay for it. And then you can then implement this plan. It's also certainly possible to hire a forester just on your own dime. It's just a little more expensive. But if you are interested in getting any kind of advice, we certainly have professionals that we could connect you with to kind of look at the property and say, okay, maybe you need to do some brush management. Maybe you need to thin some of these younger trees for the benefit of the larger trees. To try to keep things healthy. And certainly if you want to timber it in the future, then you're going to want to make sure that you improve the forest stand such that those more valuable trees are able to get the resources they need in order to grow big enough to be harvested one day. So larger farms that have more acreage to work with also tend to have unproductive wet areas. Everyone's probably seen, whether you farm or not, you drive by a field and there's just a spot that's almost permanently wet, and that soil stays cold and that soil crusts over when it does dry out, and it just doesn't grow anything very well at all. Usually it's just bare dirt year round until the crops around it just grow too tall and hide it. So that's another spot in the field where a lot of times you're losing money trying to plant there, but what do you do with it? That's an instance where it may have been a wetland to begin with that was converted possibly decades ago into farmland, and it's just not working as farmland anymore. And the hydrology and the topography of the surrounding land just wants to use it as a wet area. So when that's the case, it might actually be beneficial to convert that back into a wetland. And I know the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in particular has done this on quite a few farms in the area. And they have cost share to help create these shallow ponds basically that are beneficial to wetland birds. People who hunt waterfowl tend to enjoy them because it's, you know, good hunting there. It's aesthetically pleasing. It provides ecosystem services. People tend to think of swamps as not such a good thing, but really wetlands are called the lungs of the earth for a reason. They're a filter and they're just wonderful things to have around. They provide tons of ecosystem services in addition to potentially helping with the drainage problems in the rest of your field. So it might be good to break a tile that's not functioning well or break a tile that's just no longer needed, or to just let these areas go back to wetland naturally and maybe do some plantings. In this picture in the bottom right, I might advocate for maybe a little more of a vegetative buffer between those soybeans and the edge of the water here, but you can see that they do have some grasses there that are kind of helping to filter out anything that may be coming off that field before it gets into the water. And certainly things like this can be great habitat for things like little green herons here, which I think are adorable, and they definitely make me happy for my wildlife watching opportunities. So that was the end of that portion of the presentation. Did anybody have any questions so far? Or comments or anecdotes? Anything to share? All right. Well, if not, then we can move right along here. This is actually the portion of the presentation that my coworker who deals more with game birds was supposed to give, so I'll do my best. But as you can see, this presentation was titled, "How Can We Maximize Benefits for Grassland, Wildlife, and Protect the Environment?" So the program that she was working for really promoted the Farm Bill programs heavily because, as I mentioned, they have some cost share assistance available for grassland habitats, which are great for game birds. They thought that it offered the best opportunity, the most bang for the farmer's buck, as it were, trying to establish these grasslands. But it's interesting to realize that over 99% of Michigan's grasslands have been lost, which equates to more than 2 million acres. When we learn about what Michigan looked like pre-settlement, we're all, I think, familiar with the huge white pine forests that we used to have, primarily white pine. We know that Michigan was initially kind of built upon the timber industry before auto really became a thing. Um, but there were areas aside from the pines, there were grassland areas that were native to Michigan, and those tend to make great farmland. So most of them have been converted, and the monocultures that we get from row crops don't provide the same kinds of habitat benefits. And so now we're in a situation where over 99% have been lost. So some of the wildlife benefits we can get from grassland is that it makes great habitat for game species like pheasants, deer, turkeys, waterfowl, rabbits. Things like deer and rabbits are also kind of adapted to survive better in urban environments than maybe some of these other animals are, but especially if you have someone who likes to hunt in your life, I'm sure that they would love to hunt some grassland areas, particularly when it comes to pheasants. Pheasants are a popular game species and they are declining. They are actually not native to North America. They were introduced from Asia, and they were introduced on actually the west coast of the country. I believe it was Oregon, if I remember correctly, and they just spread east all this way. But, you know, even 20 years ago, they were far more common than they are nowadays, unfortunately. And they became a naturalized species, so not invasive, but they were not they became a species that was common in Michigan and didn't really hurt anything. So there was really no harm in keeping them around as a game species. And in fact, people who promote, hunting and things, they're very much motivated to keep this habitat around, which provides kind of a collateral benefit for the other species that might utilize this habitat. So game species use grasslands for nesting, winter and escape cover, things like that, things of that nature, as well as, of course, food. But as I said, there can be collateral benefits for rare species and grassland birds. In particular, grassland birds are among the most imperiled species in North America. The declines are absolutely unreal. Depending on the species, since the 1970s, some of them have declined 45% up to 90% from what they were just 40 years ago. And they are still declining because their habitat is just being taken up. It's also great habitat for pollinators. I think the poster child for pollinators lately has been the monarch butterfly, another nice charismatic insect. But again, they're a species that's been experiencing precipitous declines just in the last couple of decades. In fact, to the tune of 90% decline in monarch butterflies in North America just in the last 20 years. They are a globally distributed species, so we're not exactly in danger of having the monarch go extinct, but the phenomenon of the monarch migration might go away. These butterflies that have the instinct to migrate from Canada all the way down to Mexico, there might not be enough of them to carry that on. We don't know exactly how that works. It's kind of mysterious how they have that instinct to fly that far and how they know where to go, even though they've never been there before. And having these precipitous declines puts that phenomenon, which is, to my knowledge, pretty much unique. It puts that at risk. So having more grassland habitat obviously can be of great benefit to a lot of different species. So it does provide nesting cover. As I mentioned, Michigan definitely highlights pheasants as a big conservation goal, as well as other migratory grassland birds. If we conserve pheasant habitat and try to manage for pheasant habitat, there are still a lot of other species that will benefit from that. Grasslands provide critical brood rearing, foraging, and fawning habitat. So once again, deer have managed to use a lot of different ecosystems for reproduction, but things like bobwhite quail and pheasants and other game bird species that are more grassland dwellers, they need this kind of habitat in order to reproduce. In fact, the variety of insects that the chicks need to be raised healthily is very interesting. There have actually been some studies done on sage grouse out kind of in the southwest of the country, where they found that land that had been grazed intensively and responsively with cattle, and then those cattle were moved away and the land was allowed to rest for a given period of time, maybe a month or two, before the cattle grazed it again, they found that the sage grouse actually had much better success raising their chicks on that land than they did even in the neighboring land that was in a nature reserve that was never touched, because the land in the nature reserve created too much thatch as the grasses died and were just kind of left in place to oxidize and smother the soil below. They didn't have the insect diversity necessary to raise those chicks. So having active management in our grassland areas can be very important depending on the target species you have that you're trying to create habitat for. And also maximizing forb diversity can be a great thing to do. So grasses, we all know what grasses look like. Forbs are more of kind of a broadleaf plant, so a lot more of your flowers are going to be forbs. Maximizing forbs can be great to maximize your insect diversity for some species, but there are also other species, particularly some grassland songbirds, that don't want the forbs to be maximized. They'd prefer the grasses. So it really kind of, you got to tailor things to what your target species is, but in general, variety is key. So next slide is a little bit gross, but it's kind of interesting to see. These were the contents of a pheasant chick's crop. So you can see that he'd been eating a number of seeds, but more than that, he had eaten a lot of insects. And there really are a lot of different types of insects for just one little chick's crop. You can see we've got crickets, there's grasshoppers, beetles, leaf hoppers, might be some lepidopterans, looks like even a couple of snails. There's all kinds of things in there. And if you don't have the variety of plants to support these insect populations, then chances are you're not going to get the healthy chick populations to go along with it. And that's going to contribute to the declines, in addition to the fact that they don't have anywhere to shelter from predators or to shelter in the winter. So with that, during the winter, birds become vulnerable to predation, exposure, and starvation. And it's interesting to note that more birds are actually killed by exposure and by predators than they are by starvation. They can probably find enough seeds to get by. They can scavenge things, especially if they're in agricultural areas. There may be some spent grain, or maybe people are putting out some food because they like to feed birds. But there's really not much they can do if they don't have the shelter they need to get out of the weather or to get away from predators. In fact, it's interesting to note that even in the spring and summer when they're brooding, that if you have a prairie strip that is less than 30 feet wide, that's really not enough space for them to get away from predators. If you've just got a very small patch of prairie, it's likely that a passing fox or something will know, well, you better look right there because there's likely to be something yummy hiding in that. Whereas if you have something that's 30 feet wide, maybe a bit longer, it gives them more space to kind of spread out and really hunker down and not get found. So even in the winter, when you have those stands that are still standing, that provides them enough shelter to get through the winter. Did we skip one? No. So cool season grasses provide low quality winter cover. So cool season grasses tend to be more exotic species. Most of our turf grass species are cool season grasses. There are also some ornamental species that may be cool season grasses. So that means that they grow more when the seasons are cool, during the spring and the fall, when things aren't super hot like they are in the summer. But you can see that they just don't provide a lot of shelter in the winter, really. They just kind of get smashed down by the snow. Whereas if you plant native grasses, it's a night and day difference. Native grasses provide critical winter cover for pheasants, deer, rabbits, and other wildlife, including pollinators, like we were talking about earlier, and other insects. A lot of our native bees will nest inside hollow stems in the winter. They don't all form hives like a honeybee or a bumblebee would. They'll nest inside these stems. You might have pupas from well, not monarchs, but other butterfly species, as well as some moth species. And of course, the birds themselves are sheltering in there as well. So it's much better habitat if you're able to plant native grasses. As I mentioned, grassland birds have declined more than any other group of birds, with 40 to 90% declines over the past 30 years, which is really kind of crazy to realize the rate at which they are going away compared to other birds, especially when other bird species that might be more charismatic or more well-known have been doing a little bit better. So I don't know about yourselves, but it's been a long time since I've seen a meadowlark. I think it's been probably close to 20 years since I've heard a bobwhite quail in Genesee County. Maybe I'm not in the right areas, but their habitat is really going away. And I'm not sure I've ever seen a bobolink, this little guy on the far right here. These are all grassland species and that just don't really have the habitat anymore. So now we're going to talk a little bit about maintenance versus management. So this might be some terminology that would be a little more useful if you were in a government program with the government cost share in order to help pay for your grassland habitat. But they define maintenance as ensuring that what was originally planted is still there at the end of the contract. So this would mean that in order to make sure you still have maybe that same species diversity, all the species you planted at the beginning, at the end of your 10-year contract, you would need to control pests, which would probably be things like brush, grasses, and broadleaves that try to move in and kind of take over and jeopardize the quality of the cover, or jeopardize the ability of these plants to regenerate sustainably and to continue on over the course of that 10-year contract. You also want to make sure that it is protected against erosion. So maintaining vigorous growth will do this. If you have grasses that start to die out or other species that start to die out and leave bare spots in your field, that's not good. You're likely to get raindrops hit that bare soil and just carry it right off the field and create erosion problems. But if you've got a living root in that soil at all times, it's going to hold that soil in place and you're not going to get that erosion. Now, management, as opposed to that maintenance, for management, you want to ensure that what was originally planted continues to provide wildlife habitat. So this is focused more on the function of the species you planted rather than the species themselves. So in order to manage it, to provide this function, you want to set back the grasses to allow broadleaves to flourish. This might require things like prescribed burning, disking, or herbicide applications. Obviously, this would be in a situation where you want to allow more forbs to grow, like if you're managing for pheasants versus, say, meadowlarks, which might want more grassy plants than forbs. But if you're managing for something that wants more forbs and fewer grasses, you're going to need to manage, because over time, those grasses are going to pretty much choke out those flowers. These plants evolved with the like things like wildfire and stuff moving through. They evolved being able to deal with disturbance. So if we don't periodically cause that disturbance, the grasses are going to be able to take over just like they do in your lawn. And something like a dandelion might be able to get in there and infiltrate your lawn, but something like an echinacea or some of these yellow coneflowers here are less likely to be able to do so. You also want to promote an open stand. So again, controlling that brush through potentially prescribed burns, disking, and herbicide applications. And you want to ensure diversity through same kind of things, prescribed burning, disking, herbicide applications, as well as potentially interseeding after you cause that disturbance, so that the seeds that you want to grow are the ones that are still present in that environment. So this was actually a photo of a grassland that a friend of mine and I encountered in the Flushing Nature Park right here locally. You could see that they had actually done some prescribed burns to try to control their grassland, their grassland's growth. So at the top here, we figure that these two photos have probably been taken about a year after this land was burned. You can see that these smaller trees here were killed off by the burn, whereas some of the larger ones were tall enough and able to withstand it. But all of these smaller trees were also able to come back from the roots. So they weren't completely killed off, just the foliage for these stems didn't make it through. You can also see some kind of burn damage to the grass tussock sides here and a little bit on the residue, but that's good. It allows for these the forb seeds to kind of take over and do their job as opposed to being overrun by grasses. And on the bottom here, we figured this side had probably been burned on the right maybe 2 to 3 years before, whereas the side on the left had never been burned. And you could definitely see a huge difference between those two. There was so much brush on the left side and some goldenrod, but not really a lot of diversity of plants for these grassland species to utilize. Whereas on the right side, you can see all that purple lupine out there. There was a lot of Virginia spiderwort, cut plants, all kinds of interesting, beautiful flowers interspersed with all of these green things, you know, different forbs and grasses that the animals could utilize as well. So again, this PowerPoint was originally geared more towards people involved in government programs, but Michigan CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program, and it's the primary program that at least producers in our area tend to use to fund their conservation, cover their grassland installations and things. So their policy is that you have to manage. And here is another example that you can see on the left-hand side of the screen. This CRP had never been disked, whereas on the right-hand side, this photo was taken 5 months after it had been disked. And you can see, even in this rather grainy, granular photo, that there was a big difference in diversity of plants and what those plants looked like, and even the vigorous growth of the plants by creating that disturbance. So grassland management process, if you do a government program, you'll need to start out with a contract. You need to understand why you need to manage the grassland in that contract, and then you need to decide what you want to do to manage that land. So maybe you don't want to burn, maybe you don't want to apply herbicides, but to figure out how you would manage it. So this slide is a little more technical than I think we need to get into here, but just if you do have questions or if you are interested, please feel free to let us know and we can put you in touch with the NRCS and the FSA over at the USDA, and they can give you some recommendations for how to enroll, how to apply, what to do when you re-enroll, and then how you would manage that land. And if you are not interested in getting into a government program, let us know anyway, and we can give you some technical assistance even if you don't get financial assistance from the government. We can certainly at least give you some advice and point you towards some resources that may be useful. But I think step 2 of why is definitely relevant to our purposes here. So we want to ensure wildlife habitat, like we kind of discussed. We want to encourage legumes and wildflowers to kind of promote that diversity, in addition to the fact that legumes can fix nitrogen, so they can kind of help to fertilize the plants around them when they decompose, which is pretty darn cool. Not a lot of plants can do that. We also want to create an abundance of early successional plants or annual plants. It's particularly nice when you first plant your beautiful grassland and you're so excited to see it all full of flowers, and then You've planted all perennials though, so you've got to wait 2 or 3 years. And for the first couple of years, it just looks like nothing. You're probably going to be pretty disappointed. So it's cool to have some annual plants in there so that you can kind of feel buoyed up and not disheartened by what you've planted, in addition to the fact that those annual plants can be used by pollinators and things. We also want to provide multi-layered and early successional development. We want to make sure there's always stuff available for these animals, even at the beginning stages. And research has shown, as I mentioned earlier, that once it's established, grass typically dominates the site and doesn't let other things grow very well at all. So step 3, decide what you want to do. Do you want to disc it? Do you want to do prescribed burns? Do you want to apply herbicides? And then do you want to interseed on top of that? So if you were to disc it, obviously that involves either having a tractor or hiring someone who does. You'd want to make multiple passes that are 4 to 6 inches deep, and you want to do it on a contour. So basically, you don't want to have your lines run straight up and down a slope. That's a recipe for asking for real erosion, because that water can just flow straight down those lines. But if you do it on a contour kind of perpendicular to that slope and kind of follow the topography of the land, it can be very useful to helping to manage your grasses. You want to make sure that you've got at least 30% of plant residue left on the surface. That residue can actually help to armor the soil against erosion. So if you think about when you've got raindrops falling down, if they were to hit bare soil, they're likely to be able to just, carry some of that soil away. They pick it up and they roll off, and off your topsoil goes. Whereas if you've got plant residue in the way, it kind of provides a barrier, a mulch that helps to protect that soil. And also helps to slow down any surface water runoff you might have, so it's less likely to pick up that soil. But the goal of disking in this kind of management is to have about 50% of the disturbed ground be bare soil, because if it's not bare, then again, the grasses are going to overwhelm it, and your other seeds aren't really going to have the opportunity to get the resources they need in order to grow. So for prescribed burns, this obviously could lead to a potentially dangerous situation. So in order to do prescribed burns, you must have an approved prescribed burning plan. So you need to have a professional help you write that. The DNR has some resources on that. We could probably get you some through the NRCS as well. You need to make sure that you're following all local laws, state laws, and other regulations, as well as the prescribed burning standard of the NRCS if you have an NRCS plan. And again, they'd get you that information. And you also need to make sure that all permits are obtained from the local fire authority by the landowner. So you are responsible for what's happening on your property, because we want to make sure that nothing gets away and creates a wildfire situation or potentially harms, a house or something like that. And grass-specific herbicides. A lot of times more wildlife-minded folks like us aren't a big fan of applying chemicals, but sometimes it is necessary because the grass just grows so strongly in comparison to the other forbs and things. So the herbicides are used to set back the grasses in lieu of disking if you don't have access to a disc, or it's just not the right thing to do on your land. Obviously, if they're grass-specific, they're not likely to harm the other plants that are not grasses. MSU Extension has some recommendations. It says to contact MSU for all recommendations, but there are sources that could provide you with recommendations as well, like the NRCS. But what you do need to do is to always apply according to the label. If you end up going off label and using a larger amount, you could end up damaging things. If you use a smaller amount, you could create some herbicide resistant weeds. If you apply too close to surface water, you endanger the organisms in that water. You just want to make sure that you're always aware of what the label says to do. Make sure you follow the label on any kind of herbicide or pesticide you use. And then you might also choose to interseed. So you might broadcast the seed, just kind of toss it on the surface, or you might use a native grass drill, which typically is an air seeder, where they have a nifty tool that goes in the back of the tractor that kind of makes a little cut in the land, and then it injects the seed in, and then it kind of rolls over the surface, and there's minimal disturbance to your grassland, but it gets the seed into the ground with good contact with that seed. The specific rates at which you would seed are based on the practice that you're doing. So if you are trying to manage more for habitat that's going to be beneficial to monarch butterflies versus meadowlarks versus pheasants, there might be some differences in the seeding recommendations for that. And if you do need help finding access to, say, a no-till drill, a lot of conservation districts do have them that they can rent out. Unfortunately, Genesee does not, but our chapter of an organization called Pheasants Forever does have one that they will allow people to use. And they are also a great source for seed and advice on grassland, because obviously with a name like Pheasants Forever, they're very interested in conserving pheasants, which means they do a lot of great work with grasslands. And interseeding, you typically would need to do that in conjunction with a disturbance. If you just throw seed on your lawn, a dandelion might sprout, but something like a coneflower probably won't. That grass is going to outcompete that seed. Same kind of a thing in the grassland. So you're going to need to do something to prepare the soil, to prepare the seed bed to accept that seed in order to get a decent germination rate and get those forbs back growing like you want them to. So that was the end of that portion. Did anybody have any questions on any of that? No? All right, now we can move along to some of the recommendations we have for smaller farms. So even with limited space, it's still possible to enhance wildlife habitat on a small farm or even in your backyard. I know a yard might be something the size of a postage stamp, or it might be several acres, depending on where you're at and what you've got, but there's always something we can do. It is preferable when creating wildlife habitat to create more of a contiguous corridor if we can, so that wildlife has a place where they can move through, kind of like a highway, through urban areas or maybe agricultural areas where they don't have to cross through these habitat types that aren't really suited to them. But that's not always something that we can create with the resources that we have. There's a lot of land use that just has to be into agriculture, and some of it just has to be urban or suburban. That's how things are in the modern world. So it's infinitely preferable to have patchworks of habitat rather than no habitat at all. Every little bit that we can contribute is useful. Even just my little pollinator garden in the backyard that's like 10 feet long. I see a huge diversity of bees and butterflies and hummingbirds hitting that, and little songbirds feeding on the seeds and things. So basically, if you make it, they will find it and they'll appreciate having something rather than nothing at all. So if you've got a smaller farm with not a lot of space to work with, just use the space that you have. Trying to think about creative ways that you could utilize your space, and maybe having something that's a nice hybrid of a landscaping and habitat kind of a function. So this particular photo was taken at Dover Bee Farm by its owner, Mr. Brian Pratt. And what he's done is he's actually taken these interesting brick pathways here and used them to kind of go around these small beds that are completely planted to native prairie type species with a lot of flowers and some grasses and things that are really quite beautiful. And because he has formulated it in this way, it looks very intentional. It looks very landscaped. It doesn't look messy like it might if you just kind of converted your entire lawn to native prairie. Um, you still might have some difficulty trying to do this in a city setting or in some townships. He happens to be set pretty far back off the road, so it's not likely that anyone was going to see him planting his lawn to prairie. But as I mentioned, it does look very nice and very well kept to have these brick pathways, although it's kind of hard to really convey that in a photo. It would have been nice if the pandemic situation was different and we could have actually gone out and toured his farm. So over here on the right hand side of this photo, you can see some of the milkweeds he's planted. And over on this right hand photo altogether is another milkweed species that had this cute little butterfly and this beetle feeding at the same time. A lot of times when we talk about milkweeds, we just think about the monarchs that like to use them, because obviously monarchs are dependent upon them, but they're also utilized by a host of other species as well. And they're beautiful and they smell good. So it's a great thing to be able to plant if you're looking for some native ornamentals. You can also consider, if you have a vegetable garden or a small farm, you might want to plant native flowers and pollinator habitat right close to your farm, some of those beneficial things can carry over. I think I forgot to mention earlier with the pollinator strips, but studies have been done of some of the fungal and bacterial communities that are established beneath these prairie strips and the field borders and things on larger farms. And one would imagine it would be applicable to these smaller plantings as well. And what these microbial communities do is they can get into the adjacent cropland and prove to be a huge benefit. Maybe there might be some mycorrhizal type fungi that can help with nutrient absorption. There are bacteria that can help break down nutrients better. It's to be more available to the plants. There's all kinds of things on a soil chemistry level that can happen underneath these grassland type plantings. And then above the soil surface is where we really tend to see what goes on. There's a lot of insects that take advantage. You might have a lot of pollinators that could help with your plants. And you can also have a lot of beneficial insects that might help with pest problems. So over on the right-hand side here, you can see this little crab spider hiding out on this echinacea, waiting for some kind of a fly or other pollinating bug to come in. But you can get other spiders occupying these kinds of plantings as well. I have one farm that has a very large planting pretty much all around their vegetable gardens. And they were telling me that one year in particular, there were just spider webs everywhere. And luckily they thought they were beautiful, so they left them. But they said that that year they had to apply no pesticides because they did not have a single pest make it into their garden. And they attributed that to the spiders. Kind of like the praying mantises earlier, that's not a scientific study, it's just anecdotal, but it's neat that they thought they could see a discernible difference. You can also have things like parasitoid wasps that might predate on lepidopterans and other kind of pests that might get into your garden. You can have praying mantises, you can have lacewings, ladybugs, and other predatory beetles that you may or may not see scuttling around, but they're doing good work and they can really benefit any plantings that you have. You can also utilize just little tiny bits of space that aren't really good for anything else. So this particular producer, this was still at Dover Bee Farm, and on either side of his driveway leading back from the road, he just had a couple feet of space between his driveway and the neighbor's property line. So he chose to plant that to these beautiful native wildflowers. It didn't look unkempt enough that the township had a problem with it. In fact, it's absolutely stunning to drive by and see all these echinacea and cup plants blooming, especially since these cup plants can get over 10 feet tall. It was just gorgeous. And I thought it was a much neater look than the lawn on either side. And actually, as I was driving in on this day to take photos, there was a deer running through one of these sides and back towards his woods in the back. So the wildlife was definitely using it. And as you can see in the bee on this cup plant over here, there were so many bees. I think I saw more different species of bee that day than I had ever seen elsewhere. It was really neat how they were using the variety of plants they had in this midsummer day. So planting strips along driveways or other little used areas might be utilized by birds, bees, small mammals, deer, you name it. You never know who's going to be running through, and it's aesthetically pleasing. So it's kind of a win-win. So if you've got just a small amount of area where you could be planting trees, you can get the most bang for your buck if you're very careful what trees you select. So if you plant a food-bearing tree, like maybe a crabapple or a serviceberry or something of that nature, you can provide food even through the winter, like this little waxwing is taking advantage of on the left. You can also plant trees that help to shelter animals. I find the pileated woodpecker on the right here to be a particularly interesting example. Um, Traditionally, pileated woodpeckers were thought to inhabit just huge swaths of virgin forest. We didn't really get them in this part of the state because there was too much disturbance, and they need huge territories that are 100+ acres apiece. So there really wasn't the opportunity for them to subsist down here. But just in the last few years, we've been seeing a lot of them. There's a wood lot near my house that's maybe 5 acres, and there's another one on the other side of a field that's 20 acres, and we've got pileated woodpeckers living in there. There's actually a pair that's been spotted coming back year after year at a Max Brandon Park, which is right in the middle of downtown Flint. It's a 107-acre completely wooded park, and somehow these woodpeckers found their way to it, even though it's surrounded by pretty much concrete jungle on all sides. So any kind of little islands of habitat, the patchwork I mentioned earlier that residents have established probably help those woodpeckers to find this park and claim it as their own. And we've also been seeing them in other areas as well in people's yards. So they definitely are making a comeback from some of their population declines. And it helps when they have the trees that they can inhabit to to raise their young and things. You can also consider leaving brush piles and snags. Now, these things might be considered a little more unsightly, so maybe not something to have close to the road, or maybe not a practice that's for everybody. But snags are interesting in that they are actually standing dead trees that have the branches have probably been removed, so they're not likely to fall. If they don't have those branches creating weight or force that's distributed unevenly, these standing dead trees can stand for years and years, maybe even decades, and just not rot because they're dry, they're vertical, and they provide critical habitat for wildlife. If you were to get a forest management plan written by a forester, like I mentioned earlier, they would actually give you a recommendation of how many snags per acre to leave. I think it's like 3, so that you have these habitat opportunities for wildlife, no matter what your goals for the property are. Now, obviously, if you're in an urban setting or if you have a dead tree close to your house, that might not be a good practice because there is still a danger that it could fall. We're not recommending that we leave all dead trees, but if you have an area towards the back of your property where it wouldn't hurt anything if it was to fall, they're super useful for wildlife habitat. And so are brush piles. I'm sure we've all seen small mammals and rabbits and things inhabiting them, but you can also get songbirds living in them. You can get animals using them over the winter, especially reptiles and amphibians. If you happen to have a brush pile near a wet area, they'll tend to utilize these habitats for cover for hibernacula over the winter. And if you happen to have any wooded property, you might be lucky enough to get some vernal pools, or you could create some vernal pools. So what these are, as the name vernal implies, these are spring wetlands. They're ephemeral wetlands that usually dry up by midsummer, but they are critical breeding habitat for a lot of amphibians like the blue-spotted salamander on the right here. A lot of other salamander species breed in vernal pools because there's no fish since they're temporary, so it provides a safe place for them to breed. You also get other amphibians like some of the earliest frogs that call in the spring, so things like chorus frogs, spring peepers, American toads, gray tree frogs, wood frogs, those kinds of things all need this habitat in order to breed. And you can also get other interesting little critters in there like fairy shrimp and fingernail clams and interesting little things that you're not going to find elsewhere because they need this ephemeral fish-free habitat in order to survive. So it's not necessarily something that everyone is able to install. I do know of one person who got a backhoe and installed one of these on her property just because she loves salamanders. But if you happen to already have one and you think about filling it in, maybe think twice because that actually is valuable habitat, even if it just kind of looks like a wet spot that doesn't do much. A big one that just about anyone can do is to garden with native flowers. So native flowers have evolved with the local climate, right? So they're going to be much more drought resistant, more frost resistant, more heat resistant than ornamental varieties tend to be. They evolved with Michigan's weather patterns. So they're typically we're going to require less maintenance. The pest pressure is probably going to be a bit less than what you might get on some ornamental exotic varieties. And they're beautiful. And the big benefit for wildlife is, of course, that they also co-evolve with the local wildlife. So things like these pretty little green sweat bees on this milkweed up on the right, um, they this is what they grew up with. This is what they know. So having local pollen for them to eat is a wonderful resource and local nectar. So on the left here, we have the very showy Virginia spiderwort. We have this pretty orange milkweed up here on the right. And then at the bottom, we've got a couple of plants that do better in wetter areas with this cardinal flower and this great blue lobelia. Now, you're still going to want to make sure that you put the right plant in the right place. If you were to plant either of these wetland flowers in, say, a very dry area, you're probably not going to have the greatest success. But if you select a native plant that is good in the spot that you have, if the drainage is right, if the soil type is right, chances are it's going to be a lot less work for you to maintain than what you would have with exotic varieties, in addition to the fact that your local insects will thank you. So this is another shot of Dover Bee Farm. This was after the flowers were kind of done, so it wasn't as pretty. It was kind of the tail end of things and there was some debris that had fallen onto the walkways as well. But you can kind of get the idea, and you can kind of see how he had these individual beds set up with these brick walkways in between, which was, I thought, very aesthetically pleasing. Also, at this point, it needed some management. We mentioned earlier how disturbance is necessary in order to kind of keep things growing the way you want in your prairie. You don't want weed seeds to take hold, so sometimes it can be beneficial to mow from time to time. And also, he really needed access to his backyard to work on some trees. So he mowed himself a driveway after the flowers stopped blooming. But it gives a good kind of overview of the setup that he has. And when this is all in bloom, it is stunning. So these were a couple of other photos that he sent me. You can see his little milkweed bed right up here by the porch and how he has this landscape edging. So he's managing it like an actual flower bed, but it's so close to these other to this kind of field of grasses he has over here and to the other beds that it still functions a lot like a contiguous prairie, as does this stuff over here, which, oh dear, my IT skills seem to be a little rusty, a coreopsis or maybe some kind of a sunflower or something. But it's very pretty view to have from the porch, and you can see his chair there. He likes to just sit and watch it. So this is a view of his backyard, which he's planted to grassland as well, and also to a lot of sumac, which turn beautiful colors in the fall. And at this point, he was working on spreading some wood chips to make some paths through the grassland in the back, so it looked a little more kempt and a little more put together. But this was his view out his back window, and he was enjoying the fall colors. And I thought it was very eloquent how he phrased to me his passion for doing this and how excited he was to be able to help give me photos for this workshop today. What he said was that the one thing I have learned, which I would share with folks that may wish to do this, is the great joy that comes from living amongst all of this. One gets to experience the ever-changing beauty and growth and movements and wildlife throughout all the seasons every day. It is never static. In the myriad of wild creatures, birds and butterflies and bugs and bees, foxes and fawns, and more, that this type of habitat with grassland attracts, one gets to dwell up close. For me, it's like being in the Garden of Eden. He's very passionate about his habitat management. And it pays off. So these were also pictures taken out his back window. These are a couple of gray foxes, which are not considered threatened or rare or anything in our area, but they are very secretive. I personally have never seen one. They're really neat. They are really the only tree climbing canine there is. They actually climb trees to hunt and to shelter from predators and things. And they don't really seem to like human disturbance very much. So you don't see them very often in a semi-urban or suburban setting, which is where Mr. Pratt has installed this habitat. So he gets these things coming up and playing right at his back door. He also told me that it's just so hard to keep all the joy to oneself, sitting out here with all the tall, lazy prairie grasses gently blown in the late summer sunshine. You know, don't you, how pictures just are not the same as living amongst all this. It is just immense at times, but always satisfying, as he's looking at this gorgeous view off his porch. These were a couple of other photos he sent me. Some kind of a little raptor there. I'm not sure what kind, but it's something less common than a red-tailed hawk. I can see that much, which is really neat to see in one's own yard. And then on the right-hand side here, we've got a red fox, which are a little more common. We see more of those, but it's still pretty cool to see one going through your yard. So that is what I had for our small farm section. Did anyone have any questions or comments or things they wish to add to that? All right. Well, if not, then I am going to stop sharing and I am going to hand the reins over to Mr. Patrick Scanlon, our invasive species coordinator, and he's going to tell us a bit about invasive species. So Patrick, I'm not sure, did you say you're already able to share or do I need to?
I think I can share. Let me double
Okay.
check here.
Make sure I did this right. Excellent. All right.
All right. How's it looking?
Looks good to me.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Anna. And again, my name is Patrick Scanlon, and I am the coordinator for the Gills SISMA. And we are going to talk about what the SISMA is and a little bit about invasive species and their impacts on wildlife. So when I talk to a lot of people and I say Gilsisma, they look at me like I had just made up some sort of word. And in all reality, all words are made up if you think about it. But the SISMAs are becoming more popular, and they are the Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So I also work for the Genesee Conservation District, and it is my job to coordinate the SISMA, specifically the Gill SISMA, and I cover Genesee, Lapeer, Livingston, and Shiawassee counties. So a little bit of background on invasive species. If you're going to talk about something that's invasive, first you need to talk about, okay, what is a native species and what are the kind of gray area non-native species? So native species, it's kind of straightforward. They are things that are adapted to this ecosystem. They're native to this environment. They've evolved here. They're things that kind of belong, if you will, things like the Virginia creeper. And then you have non-native species, which are things that have not always been here, but were brought in at some point in the past, but don't necessarily become harmful or dangerous to the ecosystem. And so they're just kind of here, almost innocent bystanders. Things like the dandelion and European honeybee, which both of those are not originally from Michigan. So then when you get to invasive species, these are things that are non-native, but then also cause harm or have potential to cause harm to either the economy, the environment, or to us humans and our pets. So a lot of times when I talk to people and I ask them if they have issues with invasive species or if they know of any in the area, I do sometimes get a lot of natives. Things like, yes, I have a lot of poison ivy. Well, poison ivy is a native plant. And so generally, we call native species that some people think to be invasive. They're really just aggressive or sometimes maybe ill-behaved is a term. Things that just are opportunistic. They're especially good at being here and don't necessarily cause harm. And they're not invasive because they are native. So native species, things like dwarf lake iris, painted turtles, eastern white pine, all those native species on the top. Fun fact, those are a lot of our state symbols, you know, our state bird, our state fish, our state mammal. Non-native species, things like tulips, catnip, windmill palms, which I really want to try and grow some here, even though I know I probably shouldn't. It's best to focus on natives. Dandelions, honeybees, even lilacs, and the domesticated apple, all of these species came from other parts of the world. So then when you get into invasive species, these are things that are also non-native, also from other parts of the world, and cause some problems. Hydrilla is termed the most invasive aquatic plant. European starlings, we all are familiar with them. They're here in large numbers and they cause a lot of problems for us. Garlic mustard, kind of the bread and butter of a lot of stewardship events, going out and pulling it in the spring. And sometimes you can eat it. It makes a wonderful pesto. Things like giant hogweed, which luckily is not a very good invader because it is extremely dangerous. And we'll talk a little bit more about that group of plants later. The emerald ash borer, which again, we are all familiar with the effects of this little insect and how dangerous it can be. And then things like Japanese knotweed, which some of you might not be familiar with, but it is becoming more of an issue, specifically in the Gil-Sisma region. We'll talk a little bit about that more later as well. So how do invasive species get here? Well, ultimately, they all got here through one of two ways, either intentionally or accidentally. So intentionally, it may have been brought over as food. I know with garlic mustard, you know, long time ago, some of the early settlers, if you're going on a long trip, you're probably going to bring along some of your favorite snacks. And it is delicious, so I can understand why they'd bring it with them. It's unfortunate it's become such a big problem now. Things like the flowering rush that flower in the middle top there, it's attractive. I can definitely understand why somebody would want to plant that. Unfortunately, when we plant things, they don't always stay in place and they like to wander out into the wild and cause some problems. And then sometimes things have been brought here intentionally. The red berries up at the top right there, that's autumn olive. And that was something that the very conservation district that, you know, like Anna and I work for, they had promoted this plant a long time ago. They said, it's great for habitat, for wildlife and food and soil erosion. And a lot of those things were true, but it was a little too desirable by the birds and they eat those fruits and they fly around and they disperse them into natural areas. And now there is a whole lot of autumn olive out there, which they're actually quite delicious and they're ripe right now. So if you see some, I recommend snacking on a few, and you'll kind of be doing your part in helping to at least prevent those seeds from hopefully making it out into nature. So on the other hand of that coin, you have things that get here accidentally. And that's either through ship ballast water, that's not so much plants, but more of aquatic invertebrates or aquatic species anyways. Oftentimes they're stowaways. We move a lot of things around this planet, and it's no surprise that seeds and eggs or even adults of some of these creatures can make it into these shipments. Firewood being transported, again, this is more of an invertebrate vector, but that's another way that things get spread around. Also, sometimes it's just pet or unwanted or unused bait releases. You know, people have a pet and then they can't keep it anymore. They're moving and they obviously care about their pet and they want it to live. And so they let it go out in the wild. And that is not always the best option. Oftentimes, a lot of pet stores will take pets back if they're unwanted. And there's always adoption. Or sometimes they're escaped from gardens. Again, plants are really good at living. Most of the time anyways, and sometimes just because you plant something in your garden doesn't mean it's going to stay there. And even if it does, the seeds often have a high likelihood of making it out into natural areas. So the ways in which invasive species impact our native wildlife vary quite a bit. And I know there's a lot of junk on here, but we'll go through it a little bit anyways. Oftentimes, the big problem with invasive species is they simply displace or outcompete native vegetation. Like those autumn olive bushes, you know, the birds fly around, they spread the seeds, and they're just really good at growing, oftentimes better than growing than some of the other native species. They can often tolerate a wider range of soil types or moisture or light, and they're just extra good at living in kind of a general area. And so they pop up in a lot of disturbed areas. They create monocultures. Oftentimes they will just spread through disturbed land or even just cover other vegetation. As you can see, this vine here, I believe that's kudzu, the so-called vine that ate the South, which is in Michigan now. It's in the very southern part of the state. And hopefully it doesn't make it up into this area, but with the way the climate seems to be changing lately and the way things get spread around, it's a possibility. Oftentimes, a lot of these species, these plant species, are just unpalatable or poisonous. One of the big things that you have in your toolkit of being invasive is if you can keep from being eaten by white-tailed deer, you're probably going to do pretty well. And most of the invasive species, if not all of them, generally don't have any predators here, specifically white-tailed deer. Sometimes they can aid in disease transmission. They often negatively impact the food web, sort of a trophic downgrading. If you have plants that are growing and nothing likes to eat them, then there's probably not going to be many insects or other invertebrates. And because of that, you don't have many songbirds, because if their food isn't there, then they're probably not going to be there either. And it just kind of throws the whole food web out of whack. Sometimes these can create unnecessary stressors. They can be metabolically taxing or may limit reproductive success. I know some of these species like Phragmites or knotweed, they just grow so thick that some of our larger vertebrate wildlife simply cannot move through them. We'll talk about that a little bit more with Phragmites. Oftentimes they do just reduce biodiversity. If you have a very thick chunk of only one species and nothing wants to feed on it, you're probably not going to have much else there. And oftentimes these invasive species can alter habitat. Either physically, they can aid in soil erosion, or they can alter the amount of light that's available, say in a water column, also like the dissolved oxygen levels in a water column. Chemically, a lot of these plants are allelopathic, which is basically just chemical warfare in the roots. They are really good at producing compounds that prevent other things from growing or becoming established by them. Some of these plants can even alter the pH, which some native plants are very sensitive to that. Or they can even biologically alter it. Things like, I believe, garlic mustard, they can alter sort of the fungal community in the soil. And then again, all of this just kind of throws off the whole food web. Things like Phragmites, those stands of the dead vegetation at the end of the year, can be a huge problem with wildfires. They're not the only ones. Some other invasive species can change the frequency or even the overall intensity of wildfires, because a lot of our species have adapted to wildfire, but not necessarily the intensity that would occur with invasive species. And some invasive species may just aid in the establishment of other invasive species. Right here in the middle, we have some tree of heaven with spotted lantern planet, which we will talk a little bit more about. Much more. All of these things just kind of interact in ways that scientists are still trying to figure it all out. And we're going to talk about an example of this. This is a really neat thing. It's really awful what had happened, but I think it is cool that scientists were able to figure this out, because it was a very complex kind of history for a while. So picture Arkansas, 1990s, and there were a lot of factors involved, but they were finding bald eagles with basically lesions in their brain. They call this vacuolar myelopathy. They couldn't figure out why it was happening. And specifically one scientist very dedicated to it, she was able to kind of go through and just CSI all the parts of it, and she figured it out. So it had all boiled down to originally this hydrilla, again, labeled arguably the most invasive aquatic plant. And where this hydrilla was present, they found this new to science type of cyanobacteria that was growing on it. They named it, in the end, I probably can't say that. That's a little extreme Latin for me. It took Thonos hydrocola. Anyways, it means eagle killer that grows on hydrilla. Very creative. And when there's extra bromide or bromine in the water, that there's a good chance this was from the herbicides that were being used to try and treat the hydrilla itself. Those two factors combined, this new cyanobacteria growing on the hydrilla, along with the extra bromide, it was able to form this new toxin. And then this toxin bioaccumulated in a lot of the smaller waterfowl, fishes, everything that had ultimately fed on that plant, and bioaccumulated up into the bald eagle, and then of course caused these brain lesions. So they were finding these dead bald eagles and had attributed all of it essentially down to this very invasive aquatic plant that was there. Luckily, we do not have hydrilla here in Michigan, but that's not to say that it couldn't occur at some point in the future. So it's extra important that we try and keep an eye out for. Hydrilla isn't super distinctive looking, so I don't expect the average Joe to walk by and look at it and go, hey, that's hydrilla. But just watching and knowing and caring about your natural areas and seeing something new and something that doesn't really play well with others, if something is really aggressive taking over, it's worth looking into. So one of the first things that we're going to talk about when it comes to some of the common stuff that has a strong potential to show up on your property if it's not already there, one of the big ones, if not the biggest one that we deal with, is Phragmites, also known as the common reed. And I guarantee you've all seen this. It is very prevalent. It grows along roadsides and ditches, a lot of places where cattails grow. This will often pop up and then kind of push them out. So it's a very large type of grass. The seed heads are big, open, feathery at maturity, and these plants are allelopathic. They produce specifically gallic acid in the roots, which just gives them the advantage and helps eat away at their competitors. And it creates these huge impenetrable thickets that are hazardous to birds, amphibians, reptiles. I know that some specific studies are looking at Blanding's turtles. You can see a picture of one here on the right. And it had impeded on their reproductive success. It seems that these turtles, and probably many others, spent so much time and energy just trying to maneuver through these very thick invasive species that it had overall reduced the number of eggs that they were able to lay. So Blanding's turtle, very special species for our state, being impeded by this invasive species. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the dried vegetation can be a fire hazard, of course, and that is dangerous to not only wildlife, but ourselves. So here are some more pictures of the Phragmites. They travel underground with these rhizomes. They're very good at kind of daisy chaining along and just popping up more. One of the ways that you can treat it, there's always the herbicide option, but I know some people are getting creative with it. This is a semi-aquatic plant. It can grow in kind of both dry and standing water areas. And in the standing water areas, if you are able to cut it below the water, you can actually drown it, which is a little strange for an aquatic, semi-aquatic plant. Moving on, this is the other big one that I deal with on a regular basis. This is Japanese knotweed. Now, this is probably closer to you than you think if you don't know what this plant is. It is widespread throughout the Gila Cisma area and also Michigan. It is a perennial kind of herbaceous shrub. It gets very large, over 10 feet, has these hollow stalks. Some people call it bamboo. They call it Michigan bamboo or Mexican bamboo. It's not from Michigan. It's not from Mexico. It's from Japan. And it is not bamboo. It is not a type of grass. It's actually in the buckwheat family. And the concerns here, it's allelopathic and it can actually aid in soil erosion. It does kind of mess up the whole fungal community of the soil. It is extremely prolific. I'll go into the strength of it in the next slide. And overall, again, it's just not really a viable food source for any of our native species. And even the decomposers, having an fungal compound in it, really kind of messes up the whole decomposition thing. So Japanese knotweed, my favorite picture is this small one down here in the middle, because this plant is so strong that you could mow it all down and go over with 5 inches of blacktop and it'll happily grow right up through it, which not a lot of plants can do that. This is probably the most tenacious plant I've ever seen in my life. And they just look kind of gnarly, like something of a science fiction movie. They are incredibly strong. And oddly enough, we can actually eat it ourselves. It's actually very healthy for us, but I would be careful before you run out and start eating it, because picking it can actually cause the rhizome to spread further. And also, if you don't know what sort of area something has been growing in, or if it's been treated previously, you probably don't want to put it in your mouth. Next one, this is my favorite plant to pick on. This is my least favorite of all the invasive species. And part of that is because you can purchase this right now. I don't know about right now because of the season, but in Michigan, this is still legal to purchase, even though in other areas it is not. And this is Japanese barberry. So you will see this in many, many different landscaping strategies. You know, it's in front of dentist offices and restaurants. It is all over the place. It comes in a wide variety of colors, but when it escapes back to nature, it almost always reverts back to its green form. So it's this tiny, well, not really tiny, but spiny deciduous shrub. They have these kind of unique shaped leaves. Once you kind of get a feel for that shape of leaf, it's a lot easier to spot out in nature. And overall, these things produce a ton of red berries, which are then distributed by wildlife. And when these grow in a lot of areas, they not only disrupt the ability for a forest to kind of regenerate, because that whole allelopathic thing prevents other stuff. It will prevent that oak, that acorn that's trying to grow into an oak, from being able to take hold, and then they just are able to take over the whole story of a forest. And then because of the way they grow and those spines, the rodents love them. It holds in high levels of humidity, and it overall can increase the number of ticks in an area by a lot. So here are some more pictures of them. You can see the little red fruits down here, the kind of different forms and colors that it has. You can see this overall big picture here. You know, this reddish color, that's not what it was originally. Of course, humans bred it to be that nice, pretty color. But of course, part of it just said, nope, I'm going back to my original genes. I like being green more than I like being purple. And since this is my most favorite species to pick on, I threw in a third slide of it here. And this kind of shows you the overall kind of cycle. The mice love the barberry because they're protected with those little spines. And then, of course, the ticks love the mice. And with overall increased rates of ticks, then you have increased rates of tick-borne illnesses like Lyme disease and babesiosis and anaplasmosis and a whole lot of other osises that nobody wants. There are a lot of other great plants that you can plant in its place, my favorite being the spice bush. Next up, invasive buckthorns. Now we have two different types here, two different species that we deal with primarily, common and glossy. And I can just about guarantee that you all have this as well if you have any substantial amount of property, because this is another one that the birds eat the fruits, they fly around, and they are great at dispersing them everywhere. It seems that the only things that can really go toe to toe with invasive buckthorns are other invasive woody shrubs like honeysuckle and multiflora rose. So these things, again, are very prolific right now. There are tons of fruits on these trees, and they are being spread everywhere. But furthermore, what's extra kind of scary about this plant is this compound imodin, which is also a laxative and is allelopathic. When getting into, say, vernal pools, it really messes with the formation of amphibian larvae. So frogs, salamanders, toads, it causes really weird spinal column formation issues, and really, really not good for our environment. And again, as I said, it's a laxative. There's a cheeky picture of a bird. I don't know if for sure he ate some buckthorns, but it kind of looks like he did. It's moving through them pretty quick. And then, interestingly enough, kind of going back to what I said earlier, some of these invasive species can really affect the environment in big ways that aren't overly apparent always. But it seems that they can also alter the mammalian community of an area, causing there to be fewer deer because they will not eat buckthorn. But then, oddly enough, and they're not entirely sure why, but it brings in more coyotes, it seems. So here's some more pictures of buckthorn. It kind of has that's what I call the buckthorn. It has that kind of terminal spike there at the end of twigs. Lots of these kind of dark purple, almost black berries. Glossy buckthorn, slightly glossier than common buckthorn. And one of the things that I almost always use to identify it is if you take a knife and cut into that bark very shallowly, that inner bark has a nice bright orange, red or orange color. Next up, invasive swallowworts. Now, this is a plant. It's at the kind of the southern tip of the Gills Sisma area, but it seems to be moving. Now, this is an herbaceous vining perennial in the milkweed family. It's related to the milkweed, but it isn't milkweed. So that does cause some issues. We have kind of like with the buckthorns, we have two species that we deal with, black and pale. It's the color of the flowers. And they produce pods that very much resemble milkweed, and so those seeds are wind dispersed. The concerns here, they're allelopathic. It seems that they alter soil chemistry to favor the fungi that they like, and those fungi don't necessarily play well with our native species. And they are dangerous to not only monarch caterpillars, but to other insect larvae, because some other insects will mistake this for our native milkweed and they'll lay their eggs on it. And when those caterpillars hatch and they go to feed, unfortunately, they die because this plant is toxic. And the roots are toxic to mammals. This is one of the few things that I've read that goats cannot eat. Goats can eat so many different types of invasive species, but this is one of the few that it's actually too toxic for goats even. But that also includes a lot of our native mammals and even livestock as well. So most other mammals, all mammals that I know of, cannot handle eating swallowwort. So here's some more pictures here. You can see those kind of milkweed-like pods. And then in the center here, you have black swallowworts, the darker flowers, and then pale swallowwort. Next up, this is a big one, and in areas where this is established, it is very apparent why this is a very not good plant to have around. Now, this is Oriental bittersweet, and it's a deciduous, woody, twining vine. It just essentially wraps around trees and strangles them. A very slow death for a lot of these trees, and they are prolific seeders. They produce just gobs of berries that are then spread around by birds, and they can just overtake whole areas. And it's really, really important that, we as humans, as a part of this ecosystem, that we go in and hopefully try and remediate something that we ultimately caused. So you can see some more pictures here. It really is just kind of gruesome, but also fascinating to walk into areas where these bittersweet have just strangled a lot of these trees to death. We've done some removal events out at Formar Nature Preserve, and there's gobs of it out there, and we've we've spent many, many hours trying to remove it, but it takes some more work. And you can see here, just an incredible amount of seed being produced by these plants. This is probably one singular plant. There could be a couple in here. Either way, it's no surprise to see a single plant producing that much fruit. I mean, there's got to be hundreds right there in that picture alone. So next up, we're going to talk about Tree of Heaven. This is another tree that just kind of pops up. The seeds are wind-borne and wind-spread, so they can pop up in sidewalks and cracks in your driveway, along the edges of houses and fence rows. And it seems to be spreading even further through the Gil-Sisma area. I know probably 2 years ago, I found it popping up in my yucca plant just outside, and I keep going out and yanking it up, and it just keeps growing back. I don't know if it's because there's more seed or if there's just parts of that root that just keep growing back. Anyways, it's a very, very fast growing tree. That's how it got the name Tree of Heaven. Like, it's just growing up to the heavens as fast as it can. And they look a lot like black walnut or sumac. They have those giant compound leaves. But looking at them closer, you can kind of see the diagnostic features, which will kind of go into the next slide. And they also, if you grab them and crush up the leaves and smell them, they smell terrible. It's been likened to rancid peanut butter, cat urine, kind of like a weird burning rubber kind of smell. Definitely not something you're ever going to find a Yankee Candle scented after. So the problem here, again, these are very allelopathic. They not only growing so quickly, but producing compounds can combat and overtake a lot of our native species, produce just tons and tons of seed. A lot of them are in seed right now. Now, not all of them are. This is a dioecious plant, so they have both male and female plants. So the males don't have any seed. The females are just overloaded with seed right now. And interestingly enough, this plays a part in another potential invasive species that could be on its way to Michigan. That is the spotted lanternfly, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. So again, here you have the Tree of Heaven. They grow very large. This picture in the middle here with the arrows pointing at, this is something that I usually look for. It's almost like a little tiny thumb, like a little gland right there at the base of these leaflets. Here's an up-close picture of these seeds. You can see with those wings, they're very again, an overall look at this compound leaf. And then the leaf scars are almost kind of arrowhead or heart-shaped in a way. That's another thing that I look for. So with the spotted lanternfly, the connection with Tree of Heaven is that Tree of Heaven is their preferred host plant, kind of like, you know, milkweeds with monarch butterflies. They just go together. So the Tree of Heaven has been, unfortunately, intentionally planted in many places as a street tree. And because of that, a lot of unintentional trees have developed and are large based on how quickly they can grow. And spotted lanternfly is this little, about 1 inch long, colorful plant hopper that first popped up in Pennsylvania some years ago. In 2020, it was found established in Ohio. This year in 2021, it was found established in Indiana. And just like a week or two ago, a kid had turned one in his entomology submission to the state fair in Kansas. And so to their surprise, they saw it was a real in the flesh spotted lanternfly. And so now they're looking very closely into that. In Michigan, we have not found any living ones. However, in 2020, a few dead ones did show up in some shipping areas here. So it just goes to show you that these things do have potential to get here. We move a whole lot of stuff around in our country, our state, our world, and that's all potential to bring in eggs, living insects, all sorts of bad stuff that we don't want. So the problem here with spotted lanternfly is these feed off of a ton of different things, at least 70 species of tree, including a lot of our fruit trees, our cherries, our apples, our hops, our grapevines, and a ton of different hardwood species. And so these are, you know, a type of a true insect. They have a little proboscis, a little feeding tube that they use, so they don't chew on stuff, but they drink a lot of the sap that is within these plants. And since they are going after a lot of these kind of minor nutrients, they take up much more water and sugar that they need. So they excrete, that's right, not secrete, but excrete. It comes out of their bug butts, and it's called honeydew, and it's this sugary, watery liquid that covers stuff below it, and it can attract wasps and hornets, and it can encourage the growth of black sooty mold, which if you're a plant growing underneath this and being covered with this honeydew, you're probably not going to do very well. Interestingly enough, out in Pennsylvania, they found that some of their honeybees are actually making a special honey once they've figured out that they can feed off of this honeydew, and it has, I guess, a very bizarre flavor. Some more pictures of the spotted lanternfly and the different life stages. You have the egg cases, kind of one of the earlier instars or nymphs, and then as it molts, it'll develop more red, and then as the adult, they have these wings, and they're about an inch long, and you can see here they can just cover stuff. So I want to talk a little bit about aquatic invasive species. I know, a lot of you out there are looking at natural areas, and you might have a pond or a vernal pool or something, and so terrestrial species are probably a bit more important to you, but aquatic stuff is every bit as important as the terrestrial stuff as far as looking out for it. So these are a bunch of the aquatic invasives that most of these aren't in Michigan, or they have popped up but have been taken care of. Unfortunately, frogbit seems to be one that is spreading, and it is very close to the gill sisma. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But these three down here, the water lettuce, the water hyacinth, and the European water clover, these are all legal for sale and possession in Michigan. And yet I'm here today telling you that you should be watching out for these. So there's a whole story that we could have talking about why they're being sold. But at the end of the day, I know one of the closer nurseries to me, you can go in there and for $4, you can pick up a chunk of water lettuce or water hyacinth. I haven't seen water clover being sold around here though. And with our climate changing, these things could more readily become established. They do pop up here and there, but most of the time they can't handle our Michigan winters, or they, somebody spots it and they go in and remove it, and it's relatively easy to kind of squash that problem. So European frogbit, these are basically like tiny water lilies. They're kind of free floating, although sometimes they'll be shallowly rooted. Leaves are kind of round, heart shaped. They're almost $1 to $1/2 sized leaves. And they have these little tiny kind of 3-petaled white flowers with a yellow center. It really is like you took a water lily and just kind of shrunk it down and simplified it. The problem with these is that they create these dense mats in slow moving waters, and they grow so thick that it interferes with both humans. It can interfere with recreation and fishing, but this is also, of course, a huge bother for our wildlife, our ducks and our fish. They kind of crowd out the sunlight so that things underneath can't really grow so well. They can decrease the oxygen levels. And of course, with those two factors combined, you're not going to have a lot of aquatic invertebrates. And again, that trophic degradation, you kind of break down the whole food web, and no food, you don't have things that can or want to be there. So this is another one of those plants that just kind of takes over, messes up the food chain, and then you don't see a lot of our favorite charismatic megafauna there. There's some more pictures of it. They kind of have like a reddish purplish underside, a little spongy. Kind of a cool looking plant, just not good for our environment. So I want to talk about dishonorable mentions here. These are things that are common or close. Things like purple loosestrife. This is something that is prevalent in this area. We do have a biocontrol, a little beetle that are just nicknamed Sellas, that seem to be doing a really good job at kind of keeping them in check. Now, they're not going to eat all of them or get rid of it completely. That doesn't mean that we should go around digging it up or planting it on purpose. I know there are some people that absolutely love this plant, but overall, we should still do what we can to prevent it from becoming further established. The beetles are doing a great job, but we still need to help them out. So this time of year, even something as simple as deadheading it, so cutting off the flowers, properly disposing of it so that any seed that has or could form won't get out into the environment, really does help. Autumn olive, again, it's one of the other woody invasive species. If any of you have them, or the calorie pears, or any of the other woody invasive species, I have some great tools. One of them is called the polar bear, not a polar bear, but a polar bear, which is a very simple and fun tool to use that really yanks them out, root and all, so that you can just get the roots out and everything and really prevent it from coming back, or at least that singular one. Calorie pair, this is another one that has a very bizarre backstory. If you check out the Gill SYSMA social media, we have some cool links posted on about it. But this is one that is seemingly further spreading in our natural areas. And unfortunately, you can still purchase this at a lot of local nurseries. Gam to the thistle, this is one that, again, it's probably not far from wherever you may be right now in Michigan, because it is widespread and everywhere and just kind of disrupts everything. Invasive honeysuckles, now there's a handful of species here, but they're all kind of just functioning the same, just a woody invasive species that takes over an area and produces tons of berries that are spread around by birds. Well, parsnip.
I think we lost you there, Patrick.
Okay, I made it back, I think.
Excellent. All right. Awesome.
All right, let's see if we can try this again. I was close to the end, so how's it look? Can you guys see my slide again?
Yep. We can see it
Awesome.
well.
Okay, cool. All right, anyways, so some of these other dishonorable mentions, garlic mustard, again, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. Another invasive plant that just kind of messes with the soil chemistry. It's important that we do what we can to remove it. Japanese stiltgrass, this is one that isn't in the Gill SYSMA area as far as I know, although there is a large population of it down in the Ann Arbor area. And oddly enough, they found that Japanese stiltgrass is really good at favoring spiders in the Lycosidae family, or wolf spiders. And because of that, you see a significant reduction in toads in the area because they feed off of them. Black locust is one that was widely planted a while ago. It's a very allelopathic Danish rocket. It looks similar to our native phlox, but it only has 4 petals and is very good at invading kind of sides of ditches or roadsides, fields all over the place. And then, of course, Chinese privet is one of the other invasive, woody invasives that kind of just produces gobs and gobs of fruits that get spread around by birds and kind of take over areas. So I just want to show this to you guys real quick. Michigan's invasive species watch list. A lot of the other stuff I've talked about is either in the area or close. These are all things that are not readily found in the area, but do pose significant problems. And so keeping an eye out for these sorts of things is extra important. Specifically, this plant here, the Mila minute-weed, which was found a couple counties away from the Gill SYSMA area, but it is out there, does produce fruits that can be carried around by birds. So the potential for it showing up here, it could happen. And then of course, down here, spotted lanternfly and the Asian longhorn beetle is another one. This is extremely dangerous to a lot of our hardwood trees, specifically maples. So if you see a very large beetle in the area, especially around hardwood trees that have shown signs of significant damage to the heartwood, definitely report it. So what can you do to help? There's all sorts of stuff that you can do. Clean your gear, just pay attention to your environment. Report sightings, spread awareness, tell your friends and neighbors about these weird invasive species that you heard about today. Of course, plant native species. We can't really stress this enough, that planting native species is just such a benefit to the native stuff. There's invasive species removal events. If you're interested, reach out to me at the Gill SYSMA, follow us on social media. We do have certain events that pop up. Don't release your pets. Don't move your firewood. Just become educated like you are today, which of course, happy National Online Learning Day, which is today, September 15th. Volunteer. And also a part of it is talk to your local politician. If you don't agree that some of these things should be legal to sell in our state, make some noise. A quick bit on invasive species reporting. This is super important. Now, I cover 4 counties and I can't be everywhere. And so it really is up to a lot of people that are keen on their environment. A lot of the reports that we get do come from people that just, hey, I don't know what this is, but it looks weird or it's doing something weird. I'm going to take a photo and report it. And so that's how we get eyes on a lot of the stuff out there. And of course, it's just kind of fun. And, you get that rewarding feeling of contributing to good science. Just when you are taking photos, remember to take good photos, fill the frame with your subject, capture important parts like berries or fruits or flowers. Wait for your camera to focus. Use a common item for scale, like a quarter or a dollar. And if you don't know what it is, of course, don't touch it because it could potentially be dangerous. So that's all I have on invasive species. I thank you for joining us, and I'll take a few questions if we have time.
I think we definitely do have time. If anyone does need to head out right at 3, that's all right. I'll still plan on doing the meet presentation afterwards, but again, everything is recorded, so please ask away. This was a wonderful presentation, Patrick. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
All right, well, if we don't have any questions for Patrick, let's go back, just talking a little bit about MEEP here. I know we've got kind of a mix here today. You may or may not be familiar with the MEEP program, but I'll try to be pretty brief here so it won't go too far over. So the Michigan Agriculture Environmental Assurance Program is completely voluntary. It's non-regulatory, so you don't have to do what we ask you to do. It's just kind of trying to get as much knowledge as we can into the hands of our farmers. Because we want them to be aware of all of the environmental regulations and the best management practices that have been identified for the kinds of farming operations that they do. But at the end of the day, you know, we're really just here to help them to get information into farmers' hands. But if we go out and we do an assessment with them and give them our suggestions and they want to continue on and become verified in our program, then they would just need to implement those suggestions in order to become a MEEP verified farm, which has some interesting things that go along with it if you're recognized that way. So there are 4 basic systems that a farm can be verified in. We've got farmstead, because every farm has a farmstead where they might store things like pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, where they have their well and their fuel and things like that. We have cropping, which looks at practices out in the field where you're actually growing your crops. And underneath cropping, there's some more specific systems we could look at that deal with farms that focus on fruit or greenhouses or nurseries, so like tree farms. We also have a system for livestock verification, which is kind of self-explanatory. And then the newest one is actually the forest, wetlands, and habitat system, which is probably the most relevant to our talk today. And for that last system, it kind of can be a standalone. So you can see the signs here that you would get for being verified in the first 3 systems. This particular farm chose to be verified in farmstead, livestock, and cropping. So when you get your MEEP verification, you get the big sign here, the main sign that says this farm is environmentally verified. So you can tell all the neighbors and the passersby. And then underneath, you've got the 3 sub-signs that tell what systems you're verified in. If you were to do forest, wetlands, and habitat, you do have the option to get the main sign and the sub sign, or you could get a slightly smaller main sign that just says this land is environmentally verified, which might be a little more applicable if all you've got is maybe a woodlot that you're managing for invasive species or something. So in order to do the land management, kind of the forest, wetlands, and habitat verification, all you need to do is have a land management plan that's written by a professional and then follow that plan and it'll give you your sign. Whereas the other ones tend to be a little bit more, there's a little bit more to them in the questions. So a farm may choose to be verified in one system or in multiple systems, depending on their operation, what applies to them, and just what they're interested in. Maybe they don't want to do all of them for one reason or another, or maybe they need to replace a really expensive fuel tank or something in order to be farmstead verified. So that one might have to wait a couple of years, but maybe they'll do cropping in the meantime. That's okay. You can always add the other ones later. So the process has 3 main phases. Phase 1 is education, so attend a meeting like you all are attending today. Phase 2 is the on-farm assessment. So that's where the technician, in our area would be me, comes out and meets with the farm, runs through our risk assessments, all of our questions, and kind of comes up with a to-do list or an action plan of all of the recommendations that we would make that you might need to change in order to be MEEP verifiable. And then the farm has all the time in the world to implement those recommendations. It might take them a couple of weeks. It might take them 10 years or more, but they do it on their own schedule. Obviously, this is a voluntary program, and we appreciate when they're willing to put the time and the effort into doing things in a more environmentally friendly way, or changing the way they might think about some things if we bring up a topic that they hadn't thought about before. So once everything is done, and they feel like they're ready for verification, and I feel like they're ready for verification, then they would be the ones to actually contact our main MAEAP office in Lansing and request that our third-party verifier come out and run through a condensed list of the same questions they would have gone over with me. And at that point, they can be MAEAP verified, and she'll bring them their signs that day. So this is just a quick view of a page from our assessment booklets. This one I think was the Farmstead booklet, just to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like. There's quite a few pages, as you can see in these booklets, and it can take a couple hours if you're doing multiple systems, but they're very nice, comprehensive kind of questions. And the only ones that are actually mandatory to be MAEAP verified are the ones that include these blue boxes here. So these other ones, while it's good information, it's not really necessary for MAEAP verification. It's just things that we would like the farm to be cognizant of. So these questions try to rate your level of risk from a high risk of level 1, medium of level 2, or low risk of level 3. And you just have to meet the boxed risk level. So in this question down here, you couldn't be high risk for this question that doesn't have the box, but medium risk is considered okay. For some of them, you would have to be low risk. It would only have the box around this low risk level in order to be MAEAP verified. Now, what's really cool is the other things that are built into these questions are state or federal regulations. So it talks about the bold black print down here, and that obviously corresponds to questions like these, where being in violation of these questions, not meeting a higher risk level, indicates that you're actually violating a state or federal law. So technically that's illegal. But as I said, MAEAP is completely confidential. We do not want to get anybody in trouble. We will not get anybody in trouble. We just want the farm to be aware of that law, because a lot of times they just don't realize that this, that that's what the law says. So we just want them to be aware of it, and we're not going to report anybody. It's all completely confidential. The other thing that's built into our questions are these bold italic blueprint portions here, which relate back to the Right to Farm program standards, which are the generally accepted agricultural and management practices, or the GAMPs, which are the standards for the Right to Farm program. Where that comes in is that if you were to ever have nuisance lawsuits, which unfortunately are not uncommon these days, as we have urban sprawl moving out of cities and settling next to farms and then deciding, oh, I don't like that smell, or, oh, I don't like the way this looks, when the farm was there first. If the farm is following the best management practices set out by the Right to Farm program, Right to Farm can give them some help if it goes to court. So it's good to know that if you are MAEAP verifiable, then you are definitely meeting the Right to Farm standards for that system. So if you were to ever get nuisance litigation, you would talk to Right to Farm, they would come out and they would see that you're doing everything, up to their standards. They could talk to your neighbors and maybe keep it from going to court, or if it did go to court, they would be able to help you. So verification, this was a photo taken on verification day. Chubby Acres had just gotten their signs. Everything was all excited. Obviously it was during the pandemic. Unfortunately, we were all masked, but this was a good day. So the farm will be verified for 5 years. And if they wish to remain verified after 5 years, they'll just invite me back out. We'll go through the assessments again, and then we'll invite the verifier out again, and she'll make sure that everything is still up to the MAEAP standards, that they're keeping all the records they're supposed to have been keeping for those 5 years, and that if anything has changed, that then we're able to make sure that those changes still conform to the MAEAP standards. So with that, that is all that I had today. I know it's a few minutes after 3. Thank you very much, everyone who's stuck around with us this long. I've got my contact information here, as well as Patrick's. And we can take any last questions here if anyone has them. But otherwise, if nobody has any questions, you can always get a hold of us after the fact, and we'd be glad to have some more discussion. So thank you so much, everybody who attended and stuck it out with us these full 2+ hours, and we'll see you next time.